This is Soundside. I'm Libby Dankman. It's election season, and all this week I'm interviewing the most competitive candidates for mayor of Seattle. The primary is August 5th. Katie Wilson is co-founder and executive director of the Transit Riders Union. She's been a fixture in local politics for years now. She'd like your vote for mayor. Katie, welcome. It's nice to meet you and good to have you in the studio.
Great to be here.
Okay, I'm going to throw something at you right off the top to help people, who might be reading headlines, but they want to get to know you a little bit deeper. The Urbanist, there was an op-ed likening you to the Zohran Mamdani of Seattle. My question is, A, do you like that comparison? Do you think it's accurate? B, do you have a rap career you want to point us to?
No rap career, unfortunately,
What do you think about that comparison?
Oh, gosh. I think there are certainly parallels. I would be a little bit reluctant to call Bruce Harrell the Andrew Cuomo of Seattle.
Or the Eric Adams, to be clear, yeah.
Yeah. So I don't want to go there. I understand why people are making that comparison. I think there's the same frustration here with a certain brand of establishment, transactional Democratic Party politics that people are really feeling, and that I think is motivating some of the very strong enthusiasm that I'm feeling for our campaign.
When you are giving your, quickest elevator pitch for why somebody should vote for you, what are your top line arguments?
Yeah, affordability, housing, homelessness, Trump-proof Seattle, in a few words. I think the affordability crisis is something that so many of us are facing right now, right? I've lived in Seattle for over 20 years, basically my whole adult life. And so this was a very different city when I first moved here. We've seen this, explosion of the tech industry and just, growing population. And there's been a lot of great things about that. But it's also resulted in this incredibly unaffordable, high-cost city for working people, for working families. Even if you're making six figures, it can be hard here, right? I have a child and paying $2,000 a month for 4 days a week of childcare, right? It's like a second rent. And so I think a lot of people are feeling that pinch, especially coming out of the pandemic when we had a lot of really big rent increases. And of course, the homelessness crisis, right? Every single year, there's more people sleeping unsheltered on our streets. And so I had a moment early this year where it just was brought home to me how out of step our current mayor is with the challenges that people are facing on the ground. And there were a few components to that. One was the results on the Seattle social housing ballot measure in February, where, voters overwhelmingly told us that they want to see the city develop this permanently affordable, mixed income housing, publicly owned. And our current mayor was the face of the opposition to that campaign. And I'm sure we'll get into talking about homelessness later, but that's also been, I guess, a disappointment to me how his administration has really failed on the very issues that he was elected on, which were homelessness and public safety.
He was pushing a much dialed back plan that would have funded the social housing developer by like $10 million a year, would have had a different mix of incomes. Some people were calling it like the training wheels style of social housing. And that alternative was roundly defeated by voters in February.
That's right. And that alternative also would have pulled money away from other affordable housing. So it was kind of, robbing Peter to pay Paul.
Using the
Jumpstart
Jumpstart tax.
Exactly, yeah.
So let's talk about that Jumpstart tax, because that is something that you were credited with championing in Seattle. It's the tax on large payrolls, high payrolls in Seattle. It's been used many times to bridge our budget deficit since then. Although, as you mentioned, this was something that was passed with, specific buckets of uses in mind, housing being a large one of them, affordable housing. Now the city is looking at a $240 million lower revenue projection over the next couple of years. What is your plan if you are elected mayor to bridge that gap?
Yeah. So, I've done a lot of work over the years on progressive revenue and trying to figure out how we can right our upside-down tax system, right? We have the 49th now out of 50 most regressive tax system in the whole nation. And Jumpstart was a big part of that. So back in 2020, I led on designing and passing Jumpstart. And it's been very successful and really saved us from devastating service cuts during the pandemic. But we have this structural budget shortfall, which, maybe not get too into the weeds about the causes of that. But, for example, we have a state levy lid cap, right, a 1% increase in property taxes. And so whenever inflation goes higher than 1%, there's this gap between revenue and expenses. And so we've seen that on overdrive, right, in the years coming out of the pandemic. And then there's some other factors in there as well, high inflation just being a big driver there. And in 2023, I served on the Seattle Revenue Stabilization Work Group, which was convened to look into the city's revenue options, looking ahead to this structural budget shortfall where the gap we knew was widening and widening. And we have options, right? We can do a local capital gains tax. There are ways we may be able to turn the dial on Jumpstart to raise more revenue. We have to be a little bit careful there because there are some indications that Amazon and other large employers may be shifting some high-paid jobs like to the east side, so we don't want that to happen at scale. And then there's this new proposal coming out of Councilmember Rink's office for a B&O tax restructure, right? There are some other, I in the Transit Riders Union, the organization I work with, we researched and published a pretty extensive report on the city's revenue options and put that out in 2023. So there's other options in there that are worth developing and that just are going to take a little bit more work. Unfortunately, the current mayor didn't do that work. And so it's been a couple of years, and now we're looking ahead at cuts to Medicaid, cuts to SNAP benefits, cuts to federal grant programs that are going to impact Seattle residents. And we're really on the back foot. And that's, looking ahead now, we have this $250 million budget shortfall. So the time to pass regressive revenue was really 2 years ago. So this is all just a wind up to what we should do now. But, just to establish, unfortunately, we are on the back foot at this point. I strongly support the proposal that came out of Rink's office to do this B&O tax restructure, and that the mayor is also supporting, thankfully. And that will raise, I think, around $90 million a year. That's assuming the council passes the proposal, that will go to voters in November. But I definitely also think that we should be doing a local capital gains tax. And we should be developing some of these other options, like a vacancy tax. There's some ways that we could look at reforming our property tax to make it more progressive. So there's just some more groundwork that needs to be laid so that we have these more kind of shovel-ready tax options at our disposal. And at the same time, we also obviously need to be using our existing revenue as effectively and efficiently as possible and reviewing all the programs we're funding, making sure that we're using that revenue to get the best results for the people of Seattle. So we also can't be afraid to change the way we're using the money we have.
So let's talk about one of the top issues with the way that, voters prioritize in polls, at least, what they care about the most. That's housing and homelessness. On homelessness, I think that the mayor is, from what I've seen, I haven't spoken to him for this campaign season yet. We're going to do that interview in a few days, really emphasizing that he has raised the number of encampment removals and reduced visible homelessness. And in the course of that, he's arguing that they have made, more offers of housing and services through that process. There's also, the issue, however, that opponents like yourself have brought up, that shelter capacity has been reduced overall during the course of his tenure. Now, the city will say they have, increased the number of shelter beds they have funded, but through other cuts, overall shelter beds are down. How would you approach homelessness differently than what the mayor is currently doing?
Yeah, good question. And, I think back to 2021 when Harrell was running for mayor. And at that point, he was promising to open 2,000 units of emergency housing and shelter in his first year. And it just didn't happen. And as you mentioned, we've lost shelter capacity every year he's been in office. And this is so disappointing because although, as you said, he's really stepped up encampment removals, so we have a lot fewer visible tents in Seattle, but the people are still there. And we have more people sleeping unsheltered every single night than we did 4 years ago. And that's the part which to me is so, it's heartbreaking, right? It's a tragedy for those folks, But it's also, frankly, it contributes to the public safety problems. And, crime is starting to fall in Seattle, which is great. But it's taken longer in Seattle than in other cities around the country to start falling from the big spike that we saw during the pandemic. And I really think that this administration's failure to meaningfully address the homelessness crisis is part of why. Because, you think about it, right? There are thousands of people on the street with nowhere to go, and they're being relentlessly swept from place to place without the meaningful offers of shelter and services that could actually get them inside, because we just don't have the places for them to go. And now they're destabilized, right? So instead of sleeping in a tent, you have someone sleeping in the doorway of a small business, and they're really stressed out, and maybe they have a crisis, and they break the windows, or they're behaving aggressively toward customers. And so this kind of public disorder and lack of safety, I think, is really related to the fact that we haven't succeeded in getting people inside. And so as mayor, what I would do is very aggressively open new shelter. And, not just...
How do you do that?
Tiny house villages. We have tiny homes sitting empty in storage lots, in SoDo, in Interbay. We have them, and there's places to put them, right? There are nonprofit service providers that want to operate these villages, and it's just not been a priority for this administration to actually create more tiny house villages. And now there's other forms of shelter too. I think, doing more with partnerships with faith communities is important. I also think, we have a lot of empty studio apartments in this city, right? We're kind of overbuilt for studios, both in the affordable housing sector and in the market rate sector. And I could envision doing a municipal rent voucher program, kind of like a local version of Section 8, for the many, many homeless folks who don't have complex issues related to drugs and mental illness, right? And obviously a lot of people do, but there's also those who don't.
They don't need the wraparound services.
They don't need the wraparound services. Mm-hmm. And if we could just buy down rent, to help them get back on their feet, right, that can make a big dent as well. Now, for the folks who do need that really intense help, we need to do better at how we are providing that. So even once you get someone into shelter or into permanent supportive housing, we need to make sure that the services, the treatment they need are as much as possible on site. Because what we have now is this very fragmented, disjointed system where you might have someone who's in housing or shelter, but then, let's say they need drug treatment and they have to go across town and the clinic's only open for a couple of hours and then they miss it, and now they're kind of back in a bad cycle, right? And so we need to be a lot more intentional about how we're putting together the different pieces of this system, everything from the initial outreach to how we're working with our police department and the criminal legal system to all of the services that we're providing. Yeah.
What about housing and the number of units built? Obviously, the comprehensive plan is going to be passed by the time the next mayor comes into office. How do we get housing costs down in the city?
Yeah, I do think there are, even though the main kind of comprehensive plan will be passed, I think there are still opportunities coming up to be improving our zoning and land use laws so that we are allowing more housing to be built in great neighborhoods around the city, especially family-size housing. It's a personal issue for me with a child living in an apartment. But beyond the comprehensive plan and zoning and land use, I think we can also do more, obviously supporting the new Seattle social housing developer, exploring using the city's bonding capacity to kind of expedite building out some of that housing, making sure that the permitting process, all the parts that the city has to do with siting and developing housing, make sure all that's as efficient and streamlined as possible. And then continuing to investing more in workforce housing and affordable homeownership models too, I think is really important. We have some great community land trusts and organizations that are really focused on building homes that are affordable to buy for lower and moderate income families. And I think that's especially important when we're thinking about how to prevent displacement, in Southeast Seattle and some of the communities that have already taken a lot of development in a way that's proved harmful.
On public safety, Mayor Harrell has a lot to celebrate. We've seen crime rates go down. They're finally above water on hiring. And the police chief, Sean Barnes, has said that this year, once data comes in, is going to be the best one maybe ever for hiring. What is your argument for changing course on public safety, and what would you do differently?
Yeah, good question. And I obviously good that crime is moving down, right? I think from talking to people around the city, there's still big issues, right? Like a lot of people don't feel safe. And I think this goes back to what I was saying before about, it's taken longer for crime to start falling here. And I think a lot of that has to do with our failures on homelessness. And I think, it seems like the department is headed in a little bit of a hopeful direction with the leadership. It's a shame that we spent so much time with the previous police chief and, paying attention to a sex scandal when we should have been focusing on public safety. So I think there's been some real leadership issues that are, unfortunate. Hopefully we're getting beyond those. We still have long-standing issues with our police department, both with culture. There's lawsuits going on gender discrimination, racial discrimination. And we also have a broken accountability system, right? We have Office of Police Accountability where the people investigating allegations of misconduct are officers who rotate off the force and then rotate back on. So they're expected to investigate officers who are going to have their back later. So that's a really deep conflict of interest. And I think it's unfortunate that we didn't make that much progress on accountability in the last police contract negotiation. And similarly with expanding alternative response, right? We have the CARES department, which is great, but it's still very small compared to some other cities around the country, which have gone much further in civilianizing response to mental health crises and a much wider range of calls than we've done that for, and really just civilianizing many more roles that the police don't need to be performing. And, right, we're spending way too much on police overtime, right? Like over $100 million a year. Police who are exhausted and overworked are not making their best decisions. So we need to do something about that.
Seattle's current mayor running for a second term. You are in a situation where you're sort of running to the left. You're running as a progressive. What is your closing argument for people who say things seem to be going in a more positive direction? We haven't reelected a mayor, since 2005 in the city of Seattle. Maybe it's time to stick with somebody. What is your real pitch for somebody who's kind of on the fence and thinks, let's see what else, Mayor Harrell can do? Why do you think that it is time now for a change? Just in the final, it's about 90 seconds you have.
Okay, yes. Well, I think we've seen Harrell take some pivots to the left in the last few months toward more progressive positions and actions because of my campaign, right? We've seen this with his support for the B&O tax, and, that's great. But we need a mayor who's going to lead with vision and with integrity, not just in an election year, but every year. And I think that the failures that we've seen on homelessness are really disqualifying. We cannot have another 4 years when every year there are more people living and dying on our streets. And I just, again, as a renter, as a transit rider, as someone who, makes less than the median income, right? People are not okay, right? People are stretched thin and they don't know how they're going to afford childcare next month. They're contemplating leaving the city because they can't afford it here. Or, they want to build a life here, but they can't envision ever owning a home. And so I think we need much more of a sense of urgency around tackling that affordability crisis so that young people, young families, and seniors, right, like all of us, right, people of all ages are struggling all around the city. And we need vision and we need action to build an affordable Seattle.
Any final thoughts in the last 30 seconds? We have Katie Wilson, co-founder and executive director of the Transit Riders Union. Just as people are thinking about their vote here, they're going to be getting their ballots right around the time that this airs. 30 seconds, just a final thought.
Yeah, vote, vote, vote. I mean, over half of Seattle voters usually don't vote in a off-year mayoral election, and especially in a primary. So tell your neighbors, tell your family, tell your friends, make sure that people are, participating in our democracy.
Katie Wilson, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
And you're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Denkman. I did speak to all of the top 4 fundraising candidates in the Seattle mayor's race. The interviews were all recorded the week of July 14th. And the conversations are available to listen to now on the Soundside podcast. Anywhere you get your podcasts, search for Soundside. Also over at KUOW.org. And you can also check out the Sound Politics podcast feed. That's where we have a full breakdown of the race issue by issue. Thanks for listening to Soundside. And hey, this show is only possible because listeners support us. If you are able to give right now, check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m., Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.